This is TWiT.
August 15th, 1998. It was really the kind of the bow on Steve Jobs' return, wasn't it? This was the product that he came back to Apple to make in some ways.
Yeah, it was I think the pivot point in Apple's survival. Obviously, lots of steps after that. But if you think about it, Jobs was really only officially back for a very short time, officially for like less than a year when they called that event. And think about how little time there was to put that whole thing together.
Johnny Ive design, obviously.
Johnny Ive design. He had been experimenting, right? Like the beige G3 had a little tiny plastic translucent button on it. So he was trying, and there was the like all-in-one molar Mac that had some translucent plastic. But he's there. Jobs gets there. He looks at the projects that they're working on. They have this project called Columbus, which is originally going to be like a net computer. It was like a Larry Ellison, the future is diskless computers that are on a network. And they were working on that with the Columbus project. And I think Jobs came in and basically like, look at Johnny Ive, looked at the Columbus project. It was, I wrote a piece for The Verge this week about it, went up today, and I said it's like, literally, it's like that scene in The Princess Bride where Wesley is like, what are our assets? And it's like, if we only had a wheelbarrow and a Holocaust cloak. And literally, it was like, we got this diskless workstation thing. We got Johnny Ive's plastic, and Steve Jobs is like, and I always wanted to make an all-in-one. That's what the Mac was supposed to be. What can we do here? And the iMac, in very short order, was the result, and it changed everything because it was successful enough to give them cash to stay alive, to make OS X, and then open Apple stores and ship the iPod and go on to all the success that they've had.
Bondi Blue, there's a very nice, if you're interested, kind of survey of the original iMacs on The Verge today to celebrate. Came in, a lot of people remember all the colors, but it really came in that one color at first in 1998.
Right.
You know?
Original model.
Andy?
I'm just going to say that the influence of this machine could not be understated for industrial design. I'm not just talking about like other PCs. You could walk into like a home goods store and, oh, look, it's a waffle maker, and it's available with like 3 different colored translucent tops. One of which is Bondi Blue, another one is Tangerine. Like you could see it pretty much everywhere, and that is the pinnacle of success for Johnny Ive or any other industrial designer. When even people who aren't competing with you, who are just simply industrial designers, are saying that's a great look, let's use it ourselves.
We were happy because Check TV just started in May of that year, and we found, because at the time Apple implied that this whole colors is unique, and we really searched everywhere, and we went to the Bondi Beach in beautiful Sydney, Australia, and found this color, and we found like 20 different appliances that all had translucent Bondi Blue that predated the Apple. I mean, there was a vacuum cleaner, there was all sorts of stuff.
George Foreman grill is the classic. Yeah. Why does it need to be plastic translucent blue? I don't know, but it'll what did he say? It drains the fat away. Whatever George Foreman
knocks out the fat.
Knocks out the fat.
That's right. Why do you think they hired him, for God's sake?
And, yeah, that's right. He's punching it. Knock out that fat.
Was he? We have to remember that Apple was on fire when Steve Jobs. I mean, like, we forget that now.
Kind.
Not the good way. I'm sorry.
The burn to the ground kind. Yeah,
like on fire. Yeah, like Steve Jobs had to get in, and he had to find cash. He had to keep partners. He had to do all these things and do all these horse trades and all this crazy stuff that Apple doesn't do. And then the thought that they'd be able to come out with something creative was really amazing, because usually when you're trying to fix something, you're just trying to make the things that you have work, and for them to just go, we're going to, it took someone like Steve Jobs to say, well, we're going to basically throw everything else away. And we're going to, go into this one thing and make this one thing really work, was a pretty gutsy move. Like there was a lot of ways that this didn't turn out.
It was said that Apple was 150 million or maybe less away from literally going bankrupt, and that was that 150 million that Microsoft, he got Bill Gates to show up and give him.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many little moves there, and it wasn't just, I don't think it was necessarily that it was the check that Microsoft wrote so much as Bill Gates coming on and saying, oh, by the way, we are committed to supporting Microsoft Office on the Mac platform for the foreseeable future. Whereas if he basically decided to say in an offhanded comment, but well placed with PR people, yeah, you know what, we're kind of scaling it back a little bit because we have more assets to go anywhere. He could have I don't think he could have alone killed off the Mac, but that would have caused a further dive that I don't think they would have pulled up from. It was just such a beautiful play because the iMac was exactly what Apple needed at that moment. They didn't necessarily need to say, oh, by the way, you know how like all of your data is on floppy disks? Yeah, you're going to have to buy one of those because we're not giving you one of those. And you know that all your peripherals, you Mac people, are on this thing we called Apple Desktop Bus? Yeah, you're going to have to buy all new ones of those because we're doing USB. But basically the idea that they're saying here's something that's absolutely brand new in an environment in which Apple's business strategy was, let's make things more beige. Let's make things more like the way the PCs work. Let's literally start licensing the Mac operating system so people could put Macs running on boring beige commodity square angled things. This was as much a statement piece as anything else that said that, look, if you thought that we were just going to be making incremental moves, it's like we are either going to like pull up from this dive and go from aerospace into space flight, or we are going to be riding this missile, waving our cowboy hat and cheering all the way into the ground.
You know, Steve Jobs famously not a particularly sentimental guy, right? And you see it here this iMac is like a transgressive computer, like you said, Andy. ADB, Mac serial, SCSI, gone. Floppy disk, which literally every computer in the world had a floppy disk. How else would you boot in an emergency or install software? And they're like, nah, we'll just put a CD-ROM in there. No writable storage at all built into it. And most wild, they picked up this technology that while it was hanging around and the PC world was like, maybe this is the future, maybe, but it's certainly not the present. And they're like, we're just going to put that on there, and that's going to be how you connect all peripherals. And that, folks, was the universal serial bus. Your computer still has one today. You might need an adapter if it's USB-C, but like you could literally take that stupid round hockey puck mouse that came out 25 years ago. I could still plug it in on I have a Mac Studio. I could plug it in without an adapter and it would work today. And that was a huge bet because USB was not a thing until Apple made it a thing. And then they wrote it for a long time.
Yeah, I was just laughing at the word work. I mean, it was it's both really, really cool. It matched the iMac, but also in a company that's famous for bad mouses, that was probably the worst mouse of all time.
I had James Thompson, again, who worked on the Columbus project, which became the iMac. One of the things that he told me on the podcast I did about old Macs in 2020, he said that before every OS 10 meeting, as they were developing OS 10, and those were all done on iMacs, before Steve came into the room, somebody would take the mouse and rotate it so that the first time Steve engaged with it, the cursor would go in the wrong direction, so they could make the case that mouse was terrible, which it was. And I mean, I was there in 2000, right, where they had in the New York Macworld Expo, where they said, "You got one under your chairs. We're sorry, this mouse is actually good now." And that was it was a long year. It was like 2 years where that bad mouse was there.
For those who aren't familiar, it was that round thing either. That's part of it.
Not only that, but and Jason's about to show us, it was just perfectly circular, so that whereas any other mouse before or since, it has an orientation that your hand just normally finds. With that one, you grab it, and then your mouse is going in absolutely the wrong direction because it's not facing the way you think it is. You have to look down. That was
bad. And the RSI that generated. If you did any kind of major work on it, your hand just started. You didn't even have to get to the point where you were getting carpal tunnel. Your hand just hurt
because it was just too wide, and we were splayed out and clicking. And
they used to actually sell like little docks that you could snap onto it just to give it like a lower half, so it would change it from a disc into like a beetle shape. That's how big a failure this thing was.
Yeah, it was a stinker, but But the USB thing, I mean, like, I think that is Apple at its best, which is you take a technology that is, you're not the first to adopt it, but like, it feels like now's a good time. And again, Jobs, one of his great abilities, I think, was just to not be sentimental, and him to say, I don't care about breaking compatibility. This thing's going to be so compelling. People will buy USB devices to work with it. There will be adapters, whatever. And USB probably would have happened, but it would have been really slow and begrudging on the PC side. And once Apple made this cool computer with USB, basically the world embraced USB, and 25 years later, it's still how we connect all our peripherals. I know all through all these iterations. I think it's a huge thing. The fact that they got rid of SCSI and they said, no, it's all going to go through USB. And the fact that, the world, there were zip drives and jazz drives and stuff. And basically what they said is, look, writable storage is not necessary for most people. And you know why? Because this thing's got built-in networking and a built-in modem. And most of your file transfers, buy a USB floppy drive if you want. But most of the file transfer stuff you're going to be doing electronically on a network or via a modem. And they were right, more or less. Although I will say, working at Macworld back then, when they made this announcement, it was hilarious to see every accessory company in the world announce not just translucent plastic, but also announce these USB devices, and none of them were ready. Like, they announced there were hundreds of brand new USB peripherals, all of which had a little asterisk next to them that was this fall, because everybody was like caught flat-footed by the idea that USB was suddenly going to be a thing. But the iMac was enough to push them all into making USB products.
So many great stories around this first iMac. I'm looking at Walter Isaacson's book about Steve Jobs, which has a chapter devoted to the iMac. He says, Johnny Ive, obviously, and his top deputy, Danny Costner, began to sketch out futuristic designs. Jobs brusquely rejected the dozen foam models they initially produced, but Ive knew how to guide him gently. Ive agreed that none of them was quite right, but he pointed out one that had promise. It was curved, playful looking, and did not seem like an unmovable slab mounted to the table. It has a sense. It's just arrived on your desktop, or it's just about to hop off and go somewhere, he told Jobs. But Jobs, who was with his binary view of the world, loved it. In fact, he took the foam prototype and began carrying it around the headquarters with him, showing it in confidence to trusted lieutenants and board members. You remember that there was no handle on the original one. He insisted on a handle, even though, let's be real, nobody was going to carry that.
It's like 40 pounds
machine around by the handle.
That was kind of a sentimental thing, don't you think? Because it echoes back to the original Mac.
Yeah.
And it was luggable. I mean, I think Jobs was thinking, because they all, remember, then they added the handles to the Power Macs too. I think there was the idea, like in a school or some environment like that, the teacher might pull it off the cart and drop it somewhere, and you want to be able to grab it.
Here's Johnny's explanation. Back then, people weren't comfortable with technology. If you're scared of something, then you won't touch it. I could see my mom being very scared to touch it. So I thought, if there's this handle on it, it makes a relationship possible. It's approachable. It's intuitive. It gives you permission to touch. It gives a sense of deference to you. Unfortunately, manufacturing a recessed handle costs a lot of money. And in fact, they spent the money because Johnny was convincing, as he always was. There's also the problem of the CD-ROM. Steve wanted a slot, and now I don't know if it's apocryphal, but it was part of the movie Jobs. At the introduction of the iMac, he says, "What's this?" Well, Steve, we couldn't source the slot, so it's got a drawer. And according to the movie, he almost walked away.
Story.
Is it a true story? Said, "I will not release this with a drawer," and had to be talked down, I think, by his assistant. Who essentially said, next year it'll have a drawer. It'll have a slot.
Yeah. They couldn't source the slot load drives for it, and they were already on the razor's edge. My understanding too is that, like, Motorola wanted a lot of money for the G3 that was going to kill the project because it was going to be way too expensive. And they sent a team to sweet talk Motorola into a deal that Motorola should never have agreed to, where they gave them the G3. My understanding is Greg Joswiak, who's still around and is their head of communications, was one of the people there who basically talked Motorola, and they're like, oh, but it's a consumer and we're going to ship them in volume and you can get them and they were like, no, it's going to cost this. And I believe the story is they got them to base it on the price of the model instead of a base price of the chip. And then it was a cheaper computer. And so they got to buy those chips for less. And the G3 was a big part of it because the G3 was at a moment where the G3 was ahead of Intel in terms of pure processing power. And so putting that in a consumer computer allowed them to sort of say, look, you're not giving up anything in order to use a Mac. And then the other key moment, that Jeff Goldblum commercial, that's so great. Then there's no step 3. This was the moment where the internet and online services were really taking off to the point where people wanted, instead of it being like in the early days of PCs, it was like, well, I need it for my work. I'm going to have the same computer as my work or something like that. In this era, it was like internet appliance. What is this internet? What is it? AOL? And it didn't matter if you were using a Mac because it was just email and the web or AOL. And that was huge for Apple because so many markets were just like, it was Windows or nothing. But the Mac could be a good internet appliance. And by having that modem built in and the Ethernet built in, they sort of like made it a lot easier to choose a Mac instead of a Windows PC in 98.
This episode of Tech Break is brought to you by ACI Learning. The training industry's completion rate is barely 30%. ACI Learning blows its competitors away with an over 80% completion rate. Don't settle for subpar, boring training. This is what IT pros want. Fill out the form at go.acilearning.com/twit for more information on a free 2-week training trial for your team.